Good morning, Kirk. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Sheldon. And how about yourself?
Doing okay. Relatively nice day here today. A little chilly, but yeah, spring's in full bloom. We've got green grass, which is always exciting.
Yeah, as opposed to brown.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little cool here today as well. It's overcast, but it's one of those overcast days that just makes you feel relaxed.
Mhm. How's the tractor situation going? I know we were talking the other day, and you were having a new one, and then like, are you all set now for
Well,
tractors?
yeah, lawn tractor. The lawn tractor, I've got a new one and I'm just loving it. And it's actually amazing. It's more powerful than the old one, but it burns significantly less fuel. And I'm
Oh, nice.
extra pleased about that. And I mow my lawn faster. And then the big tractor, well, it's made 1957, and I just used that last week to try and pull a stump out in my backyard. But all I ended up doing was digging down, let's see, one, two, six nice tractor tire sized ruts in the lawn, and the stump remained victorious.
Now, did you eventually like blow it up or something? What have you done with that stump? Is
I
it
wish I wish I could have blown it up, but I did cut it off at the base of the chainsaw and then built a massive bonfire over that. And then after that died down, I got the chainsaw out again, and I've got it down about as low as I can get it. And now it's just kind of trying to hide it with some topsoil.
the joys of living on a farm? Just so you know, if you hear clicking and stuff, it's because I'm having to survive on these beautiful Fisherman's Friends. We're not sponsored by them, but I wish we were, because I go through a lot of them these days.
Okay. Well, you might hear clicking.
That time of year when I get a cold, and now having a cold is like people want to stay like a mile away from me and stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of like you got the plague or something, even if you just have a cold. Yeah, I went and coughed once in a store. I didn't have any problem. I just unthinkingly felt and just coughed, and then immediately started looking around and figured I better duck out of here. There'll be security converging any second.
Yeah. Put on a motorcycle helmet or something just for sure. All right. Well, today we are talking about atheists, skeptics, and agnostics. And so, those of you that are watching, either now in the future when this is archived and up on YouTube later, feel free to let us know. Are you an atheist, an agnostic, a skeptic, Christian, Buddhist? What are you? And but we're not just going to stick with those labels. We'll go into a little bit more detail on a few of them, because not all atheists are created equal, just like not all Christians are created equal. You get different people who believe different things, hold more tightly to different viewpoints, and maybe more dogmatic to some viewpoints. And so, no, Kirk, you spoke on this at a church once. Why don't you take me through why is first what is sort of the background to atheism and agnostics and skeptics, and what's the background that you would how did it all start? Like, were there always atheists?
I suppose so, because you read about atheists even in the Bible, written thousands of years ago. But I think the problem is a lot of people seem to just lump all atheists into one category. There's only, like, if you say the word atheist, they have this picture, and all atheists are that. But there's more to it than that. There's quite a few different categories of atheists. But let's start back one notch further. Basically, if you believe in a God who's active in this world, you're called a theist. If you believe in a God who's not active in this world, but sort of created the universe, wound it up like a clock, and just set it rolling and is not active anymore, that's a deist. And then you have a lot of different categories, but let's just focus on some of the main ones. Then you have people who they don't know if God exists or not. They can be, and there's two there, you can call those people agnostics, but there's two major categories of agnostics. One would be just a person who is, I don't know if there is a God. I just simply do not know. They don't believe in God, but they don't say there is no God. They just don't know. That's maybe the soft agnostic. The hard agnostic, we'll call him hard agnostic here, is a person that says you can't know. We cannot know if there is a God or not. So that's more the hardcore agnostic. And then
So
you get
like that hard agnostic that says you cannot know, is that because there's no in their mind enough proof or evidence that there's a God, or is it because God is sort of invisible and you can't see them? Like what's their reasoning for you cannot know?
The person who the hard agnostic who claims you cannot know if there is a God or not would go to, let's say, whatever evidence you want to put on the table, and they would look at that evidence and then say, yeah, but that's not proof. And so if you like, what about this or what about that? And they would raise maybe an objection, or they would say that doesn't go far enough. We're still left with having to make a decision whether we'll accept that evidence. So they would always say the evidence is inadequate here. It's not strong enough to make me believe in God, but it's just not strong enough. They wouldn't be, the evidence is against the existence of God. It's not for against it. So they would just remain in a state of indecision there. And some would also go and say, well, okay, the evidence isn't conclusive enough, but if there is a God out there, this mind and this being is so much different and superior to humanity and actually even to nature itself that we can't even connect with such a being. We wouldn't even know if such a being existed necessarily, or we can't know for sure, because we know about this much. Actually, let's say we know less than that. Let's say we know this much, and there's all this to know out there that we don't know, and God could always be in that area too. So that's the hard agnostic. We can't not know. And then you get into maybe something kind of similar. It's the skeptic. And the skeptic, that can sort of straddle. You can be an agnostic and a skeptic, or you can be sort of lean towards theism, but still be a skeptic. And a skeptic just is well, nothing you can say really. They always have doubts, and they always express these doubts. And they said we should reserve judgment. And I know you got this evidence here, but that's just not conclusive. So that's the skeptic. And some people are skeptics because they're naturally just question things. But then there's the skeptic who thinks it's cool to be a skeptic. And they're going to be a skeptic no matter what, because they think that's the intellectual way to be. And then the question becomes, when I interact with these people, well, okay, in light of this evidence over here, it does seem to point to the existence of God with sufficient strength that can you actually rationally justify your skepticism? And that's where I would go with that. I would say, look, the evidence here is strong enough. You do not have sufficient response to this. It's just looks like there is a God. It doesn't prove there's one, but it's pretty good. And therefore, if you can continue to insist on being a skeptic, then you can no longer do that on rational grounds. You're just doing it because you think it's cool, or you just don't want to think about that. Then you get into atheism. And there in atheism, you have quite a few different categories of atheism. For example, you might, one category would be called the intellectual atheist. And the intellectual atheist sincerely thinks that atheism is the superior intellectual position to hold. And they don't just say it on the basis of their own ponderings, their own deliberations on this topic. And often they'll refer to themselves as free thinkers. Now, they're not necessarily angry or hostile. They just produce, and some of them can produce very good arguments against the existence of God. An example would be Quinton Smith, the philosopher Quinton Smith. When I was doing a reading course for a master's in philosophy, I read through a lot of papers, and there was one author that to me arose as the peak of the thinkers in the area of philosophy who was an atheist. And this was him, Quinton Smith. So I decided.
So what kind of arguments did he make that made you go, okay, this guy is a little bit different than some of the other ones?
Well, I would say one characteristic is that they were meticulous arguments. They weren't just like, telling a story and hope that you arrive at the same conclusion they do. He didn't rely on, let's say, emotional chain jerking like, say, Christopher Hitchens does. He actually would present a very robust, even in the form of what we might call a syllogism, where you have two premises or maybe more that logically lead to a conclusion. And so you can have a very good argument for a conclusion, and the conclusion might be false, but if it's false, it's due to one of your premises. And so with a very good argument like Quentin Smith, it's very heavily argued, meticulous in its detail, and but it does make an inductive inference at some point. An inductive inference is kind of like, well, it doesn't necessarily follow that such and such is true, but it certainly looks as if it does. It looks like that's the most likely conclusion or the most probable conclusion. So in those cases, you have to go and talk about, well, is it actually the most probable conclusion? So he's got a very good argument, very powerful and compelling argument, but then the discussion. And I have actually written a paper in response to his best argument against the existence of God. I call it, somebody else called it the T4 objection to God's existence. There's actually 4 categories of arguments from evil against the existence of God. And Quentin Smith did a beautiful, superb, and powerful argument on one of those categories. And I wrote a paper, and I thought, hey, he's the editor of a good atheist philosophy journal, or a journal that sort of has as theme promoting atheism, but yet it's a peer-reviewed philosophy journal. So let's send it to that journal. It's Philo, by the way. And his response was, how did he put it? He had a very complimentary response as the editor. He says, this paper is, how did he put it? I think it was meticulous or something he used. This is anyways, he really liked the paper. So this is, even though he was an atheist, he recognized I had a very good counter response to his argument. And he published that. He gave it the thumbs up to publish it in the journal Philo, which is a peer-reviewed philosophy journal. So that's an example of a thinking atheist. They will concede the points. And I think a thinking theist should do too, and say, hey, that is a good point. And then they can have an honest discussion when they're acknowledging different points. So that's what I would describe as the first category of atheist that I'm referring to as the thinking atheist. But then you have other categories of atheists. You have, for example, the angry or hostile atheist. And they appear to hate God, and especially the God of the Bible. They will spend most of their time attacking the God of the Bible. You see these all the time. You see them on social media, usually hostile, rude, insulting, mocking, happily blaspheming.
You're cracking up on me, Kirk. I'm not sure.
Oh, how am I doing now?
Not great.
Isn't that interesting?
If you got a movie streaming in the background or something, but
yeah. In fact, just hold on. We might have something going on in the other office. Can I just?
Well, those of you who are watching and either identify as one of these groups of people that we're talking about, the goal here isn't to slam you or just say, right, all right, you're wrong, blah, 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 blah. We want to have debate. We want to have conversation. So feel free, throw your stuff in the comments and in the chat, and we will respond to them. Okay. Welcome back, Kirk.
Yeah, somebody else here was in a Zoom meeting. And I guess between that and this, our bandwidth was being used up. So, yeah. Oh, look, what do you want me to do, Sheldon? I missed what you were saying when I was out there.
Oh, I just said if you identify as one of these groups, feel free to put your comments in there. We'd love to have a conversation. Yeah. So go ahead. Yeah, you were talking about angry, hostile atheists, of
Yeah.
which we do have some coming in the comments occasionally, and
Mhm.
I love those conversations because it although maybe they don't fit as much into the intellectual side, it makes me think.
Well, the challenge with an angry or hostile atheist, as opposed to a intellectual atheist or a thinking atheist, the challenge with the angry, hostile atheist is to find out why they're hostile or why they're angry. And so I should mention that I I have interacted with like hundreds of atheists over the last 30 some odd years on university campuses, because I would often, I guess I've done roughly 80, 70 to 90 formal debates on the existence of God and other things like this. And so they tend to bring out a lot of atheists. And there's been a lot of interaction. That's why I can say there's not just one kind of atheist, there's a variety. So the angry, hostile atheist, you got to figure out why it is that they're angry or hostile. And often it'll boil down, well, we don't really know. Sometimes, a lot of times, it's because something really bad has happened in the past. Like I was talking with one atheist, having coffee with him, and we were talking about evidence for the existence of God, and he just seemed so angry at God, but he didn't believe that there was one. So I just said, I do not understand why you come across as so angry against a being that you don't even think exists. Why is that? And he blurted out, because my mother died when I was 6 years old and she died of cancer. Okay, that is very helpful to know, because continuing to talk about evidence for the existence of God and so forth, that's not really the issue. But he was angry because that happened, and he was lashing out and getting back at God by refusing to believe that God exists. So that's, sometimes they achieve positions of power, like Joseph Stalin, for example, and or let's say Kim Il Sung in North Korea, where he wiped out Christianity, like literally killed them all that he could find, and same with Stalin. That's their way of sort of cleaning up. Another reason I think atheists might be hostile is for whatever reasons they feel that Christianity or theism has been imposed on them, and they think it's false. And perhaps they believe it's the source of the most wars and everything in history. That it's actually, in fact, I have a quote here from somebody. Let's see, it was Dawkins, was it? Yeah, he says, faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. And so he is suffering under the urban myth, and it is an urban myth, that Christianity or belief in God or religion has killed more people than anything else. And when you actually look at the peer-reviewed research, you find that, oh, that's actually the opposite. Atheist regimes have killed approximately 100 times as many people in history as religious wars and religious people and so forth. But that's the angry, hostile atheist. Then you have a different kind of an atheist, and not all these are clearly divided into categories, because some might span two categories, but you have the activist atheists or the non-theists. A non-theist is a person who just simply, they do not believe in God. They're not agnostic, where they say, I don't know if there's a God or not. They say, I don't believe in God. I'm not a theist. But yet you refer to them as non-theists to avoid the connotations that are, or the baggage that's attached to the word atheist. So they're a non-theist. And they believe, and some of these are hardcore atheists. Some of them are, the activist atheists are actually angry atheists. A lot of them. I've met some of them, but others are not so much angry. For example, they work through the courts and media to create an atheist world by eliminating anything to do with religion so far as he or she is able. So what people don't realize when they remove, let's say, every aspect of belief in God from the government and the school system and so forth, is they're actually, when they shove that out, something else moves in, and that's atheism. And the mistake people make is think that atheism is pounding the table and yelling and screaming that there's no God. No, no. Atheism is simply not believing that God exists. And so when you create an atheist government and an atheist society, you simply create a government that runs without the existence of God, but does not in any way influenced by the belief in the existence of God and so forth. So I knew a fellow personally who led the charge for banning also any kind of religion in the Ontario school system. And I think the title of the organization was something like Integrity of Science or something like that. It's been a number of years now. That's been tossed out of the school system a long time ago, anything to do with religion. But what the general population thought it was just, oh, this is a scientist who is genuinely concerned, really nice guy about science. But in my own personal interactions, no, he hated Christianity to the point where he would just become red in the face and almost incoherent with rage. And he formed this organization with the specific view of attacking Christianity and obliterating from the schools and governments and everything else. That would be maybe an angry atheist illustration, but there's some really nice activist atheists who just believe that a religion-free world would just be the best one. Like the word, I think it was John Lennon, his song called Imagine. Imagine there's no religion. And it's just this utopian belief that everything would be wonderful. Then there's one I actually debated. He would be an example of an activist atheist. Eddie Tabash is a constitutional lawyer in the United States. I debated him a number of years ago on, I think, 3 different universities here in Canada over a period of 3 different nights, 3 nights in a row. And one of them was at Queen's University. And what his strategy was to argue for the separation of church and state in the United States. But what the general American didn't realize is that, no, this man actually is an atheist and he wants to obliterate all belief in God in the USA. And he sees the vehicle to do that as through the courts in the separation of church and state. Now, I should say something about separation of church and state here, because I believe it's important too, but for a totally different reason. And I have a different idea of what church and state means. Originally, and this was in a talk given at the University of Waterloo by, the name escapes me at the minute. He was in one of the highest positions in the United Nations from Lebanon. Charles Malik is his name. And he said the separation of church and state was to be the separation of institutions. And that is, you don't have the same institution that governs the church as the same one that governs government. The separation of church and state is meant to protect Christianity from the automatic corruption that occurs when Christianity is in a position of power for ruling in government.
You can see that happening in Russia right now, where the Russian Orthodox priests are blessing the weapons that are being used in the war against Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, that's really sad. That's terrible, actually. But so when you have the means to power, means that you also have to be religious, then you'll have a lot of people faking that they're religious so they can get in a position of power, and you have total corruption of religion if there's no separation in institutions between church and state. But Charles Malik pointed out that it was never intended to be a separation of ideas. Never. So you have ideas being very important in government legislation, whether they're scientific ideas, sociological ideas, but all of a sudden when it comes to religion, what people like Eddie Tabash have done is you're not even allowed to bring those ideas, those theistic ideas, into play as either. So the separation of church and state has gone beyond just separation of institutions to a total separation of ideas. In fact, going further than that and freeing government institutions and the schools and the public life from any ideas at all, anything to do with religion, but it's still done under the name of separation of church and state. And so that's where you see a lot of confusion today. And they say, yeah, that shouldn't be. I would argue
it is interesting, though. It's not all religion usually that's being pushed out of the schools. It's just the dominant Christian religion that's normally being pushed out of the schools.
Absolutely. In fact, I have a friend of mine who graduated in education, and she was twice hauled into her principal's office as a teacher and just verbally flogged for having mentioned anything to do with Christmas. It was coming up to Christmas, anything to do with the traditional Christmas story, or the birth of Christ or whatever. to the point of tears. But yet she was forced to, in her class, bring in religious leaders from other religions to do a religious ceremony from other religions. But anything to do with Christianity was a severe reprimand from the principal for having done anything to do with that. So often it's seen as mostly the attacks are against Christianity, but not all the time. Like, for example, I think what's going on in Quebec right now is a general attack on all religion. And then you get other countries, let's say, that have pretty severe attacks against other religions and promoting, not without going into detail.
So St. Pao has been posting a few comments here. There are angry atheists and angry theists. Yes.
Yep. Yeah.
And friendly atheists and friendly theists. Yes. I like the second group. Yeah. Friendly atheists and friendly theists. The angry ones, anybody who's an angry Christian has sort of lost sight of the love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy, love God. So yeah, totally understand that.
Yeah, and totally.
Then, so he says, and having parents growing up in Scotland and being discriminated by Protestants, yeah, it's evident why we should have a separation of church and state. So that's an interesting statement. So my mom's side of the family was Catholic. My dad's side was Greek Orthodox. We're now Protestant. We've got a good mix going on there, right? But is this statement actually an evidence of why we should have separation of church and state?
I think some of the things that St. Paul is raising here, some of it's due to, in general, human nature tends to think less of people who are different. And that goes for ethnic differences, that goes for religious differences. So you will have, it's not just the Protestants hating the Catholics. In Ireland, you would have the Catholics hating the Protestants. Now, I should be careful here. It's not all Protestants and it's not all Catholics. Mm-hmm. There's a subset in any religion that just simply hates people from other religions. But we have to remember this question: is that what Jesus taught? He taught that that the second highest command ever given is to love your neighbors yourself. There's another interesting command that goes along with this in John, is that he who says, I love God, and hates his neighbor is a murderer and a liar, he says, and they do not have eternal life. So we have to distinguish between authentic Christians who actually try and follow Christ and love their neighbor, regardless of whatever differences are there, and these angry theists. I see a lot of angry theists. They are an embarrassment to me. They actually burn bridges. They dig holes, which I get tossed into because I'm a theist and they think I'm one of them. And they dig massive holes. They throw bombs in discussions that would otherwise be maybe productive. So you have angry atheists and you have angry theists. And a lot of times you don't, well, the angry atheists, I understand, because they don't feel they have to abide by the commands of Jesus Christ to love their neighbor. But I also want to hasten to point out that not all atheists are angry atheists. You have the intellectual ones, you have the activist ones. A famous activist one here in Canada was Morgentaler, Dr. Henry Morgentaler. He's more well known for his crusades to legalize abortion, but in reality, he was a hardcore atheist, actually a member of and president of the First Humanist Association in Canada. And then you have maybe what I might call the non-theists. And I would say actually the majority of people who might, this kind of an atheist, are actually non-theists. They just go about their lives. They don't believe in God. They don't think there is one, but it's not something they thought about, and they're not in any vendetta against belief in God. They think people believe in God, that's fine if that works for them, but they're just going about their daily life. Really nice people. They're actually embarrassed by some of the angry atheists, and they just want to get along well. Then there's an interesting atheist I call the open atheist. I got two more atheists to talk about, and then one. This is the last one. Open atheist. So I did some work in the Soviet Union when it was still the USSR, and it was still a communist regime, and it was still against the law, to be to worship God, and it was a career limiting opportunity at the very least. I had people high up in university positions saying, "Thank you for coming. I am an atheist. I know nothing about God. Why don't you do a seminar?" They just were so starving to find out about God because they lived in a society where that regime actively tried to stamp out theism in every different way. The atheism was taught, it was enforced, it was required for advancing in society. That's what I would call an atheistic regime. And so these are open atheists. They're atheists by default. They're just simply, that's the way they were raised. They know nothing about God, but they're very open to talk about God and to find out more. And this would be the kind of atheist I ran into in some of these countries like the USSR, for example.
Now, Sant Pao also made this comment that I think we should address, because I would say there were Catholics and Protestants that supported the Nazis and Italian and Croatian fascists. Totally, there were. Were they correct in doing so? No. Were there also atheists that supported the Nazis and Italian and Croatian fascists? Yes. So does that mean atheism is wrong, like Catholics and Protestants are wrong in this statement?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where lumping everybody together in a group gets you into a problem where you're generalizing, and that's probably not a great idea to do. And that's why we're going through this conversation about different types of atheists and stuff to begin with.
Well, just as atheists, and I see this a lot, atheists do not like it when you lump them in as all atheists are angry, hostile atheists and so forth. And rightfully so, because they're not all that way. As we said, that's part of the point of this live stream, is to explain that there are different kinds of atheists. But in the same way, Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox adherents, all of them do not like saying they're all hypocrites and whatever. So it's very important that we examine individual claims. Like, for example, did the Protestants support the Nazis? Well, the Lutheran Church sure got a nice free ride during Nazism, but not all Lutherans supported that, and some paid with their lives and actually were executed. Some of the Lutherans were executed because they stood up against Hitler. Same with the Catholics. One of the best, most successful aces, fighter pilots for the Luftwaffe in World War II, was actually executed. He was a Catholic, and he stood up against the Nazis. And he was, we don't know exactly how he was executed, but it looks like he was taken up for one last plane ride and shoved out the door at a fairly high altitude. So what we have to look at is this really what Jesus taught? So when you're talking about theism, you can't have a Christian, whether they're Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, anybody who identifies as a Christian, they cannot be a Christian. They can call themselves one, but they're contradicting themselves if they also hate their brother. They hate their neighbor. That's just not on, and the Bible makes that very clear. Whereas an atheist,
and that's not hate your real brother or hate your neighbor that agrees with everything you believe in.
Next door. Jesus told a parable where he used the Samaritan. Now, Samaritan was a different ethnic group, and there was a lot of hostility of the Jews against the Samaritans and the Samaritans against the Jews. So we picked them to illustrate who is your neighbor. It's the person from the other, included in your neighbor is the person from a different ethnic group that hates you, and you might hate them. You need to rethink that. That's the person you need to love as you love your own self. And he used them, plus everybody else who you might find more agreeable. So basically, if they're a human being and they're alive, even if they're not alive, I think it's still wrong to hate people who have died. So if they're a human being that has ever lived, Your job is to love them as you would love yourself. That's your job. That takes divine intervention, because I would never claim to be able to do that on my own. And that's another whole issue. We could actually talk about that in another episode. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? And C.S. Lewis has got some good thinking on that. But for an atheist now, an angry atheist, that's not contradicting any kind of belief in atheism that it's wrong to be angry. You can be an angry atheist and be a legit atheist. You cannot be an angry theist and be a legit theist. At least angry, let's rephrase that. You can be angry at injustice, that's fine. But you cannot hate your neighbor and be a legit theist.
Okay, so Stephen's posted a couple here. So thanks, Kirk and Sheldon. Great discussion. Well, thank you, Stephen. I have a question about Thomas Jefferson and whether you determined that an emotion or anger was involved in his book, The Moral Teachings of Jesus Christ. So I haven't read this one. Kirk, have you read it?
I have not read it, so I'm afraid I can't comment on it, that an emotion or anger was involved in his book. All I can say is that in general, it'd be surprising if anyone writes a book on anything that is close to their heart or they feel strongly about, where emotion does not arise. I find in my own life the challenge is to try and rein in my emotions, to try and tone it down, to actually try and understand what the other person's saying. So other than that, I don't know. But I know that I want to respond to something else Stephen Brooks raised here, which is a very good question right there. Now, I'm saying there's at least 5 categories of atheists. There's 2 major categories of agnostics, and probably 2 categories, I'm saying at minimum, 2 categories of skeptics. But as Stephen has pointed out, there's now 45,000 denominations. Wow, that's a pile. I would question that number, but let's just grant it, okay?
It's probably 45,000 different church. Like, there's a lot of non-denominationals that would end up in their own bracket as a denomination. Yeah. And so you got individual churches that are included in that number.
But it's a very good question. I mean,
it's totally legit.
There's not just just as there are a lot of different categories of atheists, so there are different categories of Christians. At least it certainly appears that way when you look at denominations. There's 3 major categories: Catholics, Protestants, and the Orthodox. Those are the 3 major categories if you study church history. And then in each one of those, you have a lot of different. It's actually a bit of a fallacy to say that all Catholics believe these things right here, because in my own personal experience, no, there is a spectrum of beliefs within Catholicism, same within the Orthodox, and same within Protestantism. So how do I account for that? And bottom line, let's say you go to physics. I did my first degree in physics, and I wasn't aware of it when I started my degree. But by the time I finished, I realized, there's different schools of thought in theoretical physics, in cosmology. And sometimes these different schools of thought get very nasty, very nasty. We're talking about terrible things said at physics conferences by some physicists about other physicists and everything. I had no idea. It was actually disappointing to me, because I thought physics is above all of that. But I found that. So what do you do in cases like this? Well, let's go back to Christianity now. What do we do with all these denominations and so forth? Personally, the single most important question in my mind is, well, what are they? I'm not so concerned about. It's interesting to see how they arose. For example, the Evangelical Free Church arose in Scandinavia, and it was primarily because of geographic separation from other Protestant churches, say in Germany or in England or so forth. So there's a ton of that. Then there's a ton of people who might, more so in the past, who said, well, I think this Bible verse means this and that, and that's so important, I'm starting a new church on this. And eventually you got a new denomination starting.
And you had churches in the recent past that were fully racist.
Oh, yeah.
And so denominations came out of that because they're like, this is wrong. And so,
oh yeah, like you've got some and I would hate to brand an entire denomination as racist unless it's right in there. Like the Mormon Church, I think they've changed that now. They got another revelation But there was a time when the idea of people, let's say people of color, being in leadership within the Mormon Church was not going to happen. But I think I'm almost sure that's changed now. I read that I'm not a Mormon, so I don't know the details there,
but I bet you there was a bit of a split between the two different Mormon views on that, where some people would have said, no, I'm not believing that.
Yeah.
And that's how a new denomination starts is.
And I would class Mormon, the Church of Latter-day Saints, as being outside of Catholicism, Protestantism, and Orthodox. If you look at the doctrines there, you would say, no, this is something totally different in some very important areas. But let's go back to the denominations. So personally, me, when I move to a different city, I don't really care what denomination the church that I go to is. What I care about is, well, are they committed to trying to do their best to see what the Bible says on these issues and then teach that? Is that the commitment? So, for example, I grew up in what's called an associated gospel church, which would be similar to maybe a Baptist church, although Baptist, there's quite a spectrum there. But then when I moved to Winnipeg to go to university, I decided I'm going to a different denomination every year. So, but some I really liked. So I'm going 2 years to this one. So I went to a Mennonite Brethren church. I went to a non-denominational church, I guess they can call. I went to a Pentecostal church, and I went to an evangelical free church. And some of those I spent more years than just one. In fact, in the end, I didn't float around much anymore because I really liked the particular evangelical free church in Winnipeg, and I ended up going there. Now, then I moved to, where did I move to next? Oh yeah, Vancouver. So I became a member of the Mennonite Brethren Church in Vancouver. And then when we moved back to Winnipeg, I went back to the Evangelical Free Church that I was a member there. And then we moved here, and I became a member of a non-denominational church, which is kind of had Brethren roots. So the totally different denominations, but the thing that I look for is basically they're all the same. These ones that I've attended. And why are they the same? Because the teachings of Jesus Christ and the teachings of the Bible are central to what they try and promote. And what I'm observing as I have talked with a lot of different denominations, is there's a convergence happening here. The previous denominations, which are largely due to geographical separations and differences of opinion, as we now discuss this on a broader level, there's a convergence, so that I find very little difference sometimes, let's say, between a Baptist church and an associated gospel church and an evangelical free church, or a denominational one that I'm attending right now, which is just a community church. Very little difference. But we kind of got off track here on how do I determine which is the right one? There is no one denomination. You will find hypocrites in every denomination, but not just in churches. You will find hypocrites in government, in environmental movements. You'll find hypocrites in the halls of science and universities today. You'll find them everywhere. Hypocrisy is a standard way of human nature. That's it. So we can't look at hypocrites to decide which way we're going to go. I don't toss science because I see people are fabricating the results over in the lab over there. I don't do that. I just say, well, here's the standard, and I want to work in an area where the standard is honored. Same with Christianity. Is the standard being honored, which is the Bible?
Now, one of the other things when I'm moving into a new area and I'm wanting to connect into a church, I'm looking for a church. I'll read their statement of faith before I go, make sure there's nothing wrong with it.
Weird.
Or weird. And then I'll also see what it's like to connect with the people there, because some churches are very ingrown. They might have started by a family 200 years ago, and it's really still the same family, and it's just grown because more people were born. There's a few churches like that here where I live. But I'm also looking for is the Sunday morning something that when I walk out of there, I'm not depressed. I don't like going to a church where I'm more depressed walking out than I was coming in. Like I'm looking for, there might be times where I need my butt kicked a little bit, but I'm looking for, is this somewhere I can grow in my faith, grow in my relationships with others. If you're not connecting in a church with other people, you're missing, I think, one of the main points of church. And so that, I think, is for me, it's the right one, is the one I'm connecting in. Yes, the beliefs are important, but it also is, am I connecting in as and having honest relationships with the people in there.
You've raised a really good point.
It's all humans. There's going to be problems, but that to me is one of the big keys.
That is, thanks for raising that, Sheldon. That is a critical thing that I look for in a church as well. So if I go to a church and they have to be, the teaching has to come out of the Bible. They have to be teaching the Bible. But the other thing is, the church purpose of it is to encourage one another, to get together, to have fellowship with one another. And so I need to be able to feel at home there. Do I feel like could be my family when I'm checking out? If I've moved to a new area and I'm just checking out a few different churches, do I feel at home here that people are actually, want to care about me? Like, did anybody talk to me? Did I just, I've been to some churches where, I stood around. I remember this one church, we'd moved into another community, and I went to this one church, and I was all by myself because my family had not yet moved here. I was just here. And I went to that church, and afterwards I stood around in the lobby hoping, to talk to somebody but everybody's in their little wee groups. And I hung around for maybe 10 minutes, standing awkwardly in the lobby, and then I left and nobody. And I thought, well, this church has a problem, basically. Another church problem that a church has is just, they have their special rules, like rules that they invent that go above and beyond the Bible. I'm not interested in extra rules. Like, you got to wear a tie, or one church was women could not wear makeup. Well, I'm not going to that church because that's an extra rule. That's those sorts of things. The other one is a culture-led church where it's not about teaching from the Bible, but making the Bible fit our culture. Culture dictates the rules type of thing, and what's acceptable about God. So I'm not going to go to that one, because that would be a classic place to find a bunch of hypocrites, as well as in the highly legalistic, all these rules and regulation type of churches. I find that they tend to gravitate away from the teachings of Jesus, either to their own rules or to what culture finds acceptable, those two types, but yet identify as Christians. We've kind of wandered away from atheism, but
well, I wanted to bring this one last comment up, and then we'll end for today, because I have to plan a chapel that I'm doing in an hour here. So, Sam Powell said, well, I hate Nazis and the 9/11 attackers. And this would have been from our conversation about love your enemy, maybe let's talk about this for a little bit, because I think there's a misunderstanding of what it could look like for Christians to love your neighbor and love your enemy versus not liking what they did.
Yeah. Oh, that's an excellent one. I'll tell you, I totally understand when someone says, I hate Nazis or I hate the 9/11. I totally understand that. That is just you don't need to be a Christian to hate Nazis. There's just this innate loathing of people that in some way appear to be extra evil or wicked. And that's totally natural. So if I'm actually going to love my neighbor, I'm going to need, I told God, I need divine intervention here. I cannot do this it's not happening if I have to make myself sort of love the neighbor. And it has to do with two things. A, I don't think we can on our own. And B, we have a warped sense of what love is. It means to feel fond of the person. But Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, I don't feel fond of myself. In fact, of all the people in the world here, I'm probably most often disappointed in myself, not my neighbor. I don't feel fond of myself, but I do care about the direction I'm going. I do care about mistakes that I have made that, wow, there was terrible consequences to that. I grieve about the things that I've done that were mistakes and they led to pain and suffering. And I also hope that I do better in the future. I want to be heading in the right direction. I care about where I'm going. And this is the kind of love that C.S. Lewis talks about when he says, what is it that Jesus talked about when he says, love your neighbor? He says, you want to be grieved by the mistakes they have made, and you want to care about and have compassion for them, no matter how heinous they might be. And you want to actually care about the possibility that they could be salvaged, they could be changed and so forth, but never does it include endorsing what they did. And it also can totally include loathing horrible things that they had done. So for example, on the news one evening I was watching it, and they announced about some school bus driver who had done something that was so, I'd never even heard of such a thing. It was actually make you want to lose your supper as you're eating it. It was horrible. And what I noticed is that I felt a deep sense of grief and sorrow as I listened to this news. I thought, that's not me. That's not me. That's got to be God. That's changing me to grieve over this person who is so lost that they would even know about doing things like this. That is horrific. Here's a person created in the image of God, and they have done something that's so disgusting, I almost lost my supper. And I felt grief. In the old days, my natural response is wipe that person right off the face of the planet. We don't need people like this. We don't need them. No, there is a time for arresting people, bringing them to trial and serving justice and preventing them from harming others. There's definitely a place for that. If that's not done, that's a violation of justice. And we should legitimately become disturbed when we see violations of justice, either in so a violation of justice simply be doing nothing, letting the person get away scot-free. Or it could be people being accused and convicted of things they never actually did. Those things should make us angry.
And as a Christian, when I see evil happening because of humanity, I know why they're doing that. And so regardless of whether they call themselves a Christian, an atheist, whatever, it doesn't matter at that point. When they're doing evil, that's a sign that they are totally not following what God wants them to follow. And so society's versions of morals, Christianity's versions of morals, a lot of it lines up. There's a reason for that, I think. But we know when something's going wrong. But I also know that other parts of the world where they may not have that same morality, they don't see it as wrong. North Korea does not see some of the stuff they're doing is wrong because they've lost their, they don't have the same morals. Now, we can get into why they may not see it themselves as wrong anymore in a different episode. But when I see evil happening, their conscience is seared. There's verses in the Bible that say your conscience goes through steps where at some point it's gone.
Yeah. Searing
and it requires a miracle to come back.
Yeah. A divine intervention to come back to that sort of thing. I think that I say even in North Korea, I think people can be subjugated. They can be beaten down, subjugated, and essentially brainwashed by propaganda that's relentless and never ending to then begin to embrace things that are wrong and evil. The other thing that I think corrupts human nature is too much power. And you see that kind of power even in the case of some of the atrocities that have been committed in Ukraine, in Bucha, for example, where a person is in a position of absolute power, an individual soldier or a group, and they can do whatever they want. They can just shoot somebody in the back, and that made the news here last week. They just killed some people completely with no motivation whatsoever. Or they can rape women or whatever. And you see that's human nature. And the interesting thing is I used to think I would never do stuff like that. That was back about almost 40 years ago. And I heard a guy say there's no limit to how low a person will stoop given the right circumstances. and I didn't believe it at the time. But as I worked in different countries around the world and saw atrocities, and I saw things that I can't even talk about, I realized that if I had been raised in their shoes, I probably would have been doing those things. Like if I had been raised in the shoes of some of those guys in Bucha, I hate to say this, but I cannot legitimately say that I would not have done the same thing if I had been raised in their shoes. And so what is the common denominator we have as human beings? It's human nature. Now, that God never intended you to die the way you were born. So we're all born with the natural way we are, human nature. And what God's intention is to bring us through a process of refinement through this life so that we end this life vastly better than the way we started, vastly changed. And unfortunately, our culture today, it really believes that the way you were naturally born with your natural desires or whatever, that's what needs to be. You need to stay that way. And it's wrong to try and convince you that there should be any growth or any change that occurs in the course of a person's life. But that was never God's intention. And I have lost all faith in humanity as far as because of the human nature. If you asked me to, hey, Kirk, we need a really good prime minister or president in this country, would you volunteer? I don't know if I would or not, but one thing I would make crystal clear is that anybody who puts their faith in me or any other human being is making a serious mistake. I would do my best. I'd gather a group of advisors around me, but they all do that. And eventually they all become corrupt. Well, I shouldn't say that, but they're all influenced by this. And so it's a tough life we live.
Well, on that note, I think we need to end for the discussion for today. Thank you, Kirk. Thank you, those in the chat, Stephen and Sanpao. Yeah, we will be back next Thursday, same time, same place, and we'll have another conversation. Talk to you later.
Bye for now.